This channel is part of the History Hit network.
Some of the turning points of history just happen. Volcanoes erupt. Earthquakes, floods and fires destroy cities. But most of the turning points of history do not just happen.
This was their final power.
They are the result of actions taken by people.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
They are the work of those who use power, ambition, belief to shape events. People are the authors of history.
It's the curious thing about history that we all understand the great currents matter. The institutions matter, geography matters, economics matters, what natural resources you have matters. But I do think there are moments in history when it really matters who's in power.
This is the story of the people who, holding or reaching for power, shaped our world. The titans of the 20th century. In 1934, Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and Roosevelt are in power. The global depression is easing. The future beckons. What will they make of it?
One of the big questions about the 1930s is if the Western powers had been prepared to move earlier, could they have stopped Hitler? And could they have stopped the Japanese militarists? If the powers had been prepared to really move against Japan in Manchuria, and when Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, who knows? One person gets away with something, or one country gets away with something, that encourages others.
What did happen in just 4 years? In China, the Rhineland, Ethiopia, and Spain, was the rise of militarism and the spread of violence. In Spain, in 1934, there was violence and a Titan advanced.
In 1934, there were two big uprisings, one of the miners of Asturias and the declaration of an independent Catalonia. These two things happened together. It's a time of national emergency like this, so you declare martial law, which in Spain is called a state of war, estado de guerra. The powers of the Minister of the Interior, so that's over the police and the civil guard, are transferred to the Minister of War. He decided to put Franco in charge of the repression of both of these incidents.
The Spanish Air Force bombed its own territory, and troops of the Spanish Foreign Legion and Army of Africa moved violently through villages, like a conquering army on foreign soil.
So during the 3 weeks of this tremendous repression that goes on, Franco has what I would call on-the-job training of being a dictator.
In 1934, 1.5 million pesetas, 20,000 rifles, 20,000 hand grenades, and 200 machine guns arrived in Spain for monarchist militias. It had all come from Italy.
If you love history, then you'll love History Hit. Our extensive library of documentaries features everything from the ancient origins of our earliest ancestors to the daring mission to sink the Bismarck. History Hit has hundreds of exclusive documentaries with unrivaled access to the world's best historians. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Timeline fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code TIMELINE at checkout.
For a good decade or more, Mussolini was the fascist in power, and Hitler worshipped Mussolini. He tried to meet him. He wrote him letters, he asked for autographs, and Mussolini said, "Who is this Austrian, this strange man who's trying to get to power?"
The first and keenly anticipated meeting between Duce and Führer took place in June in Venice.
And Mussolini made sure that Hitler had to come onto Italian soil, and he wore a military uniform. And this put Hitler at disadvantage. He wished that he had worn a uniform as well. Their meeting didn't go very well in that Mussolini wasn't very impressed by Hitler.
Hitler looked, Mussolini said, like a plumber in a Macintosh. He complained to his representative at the Vatican that Hitler had sounded like a broken record.
Hitler tended to go on monologues, even when he was with people, about German superiority. So he found him tactless, strange, and he thought that he didn't have much future.
Mussolini, of course, believed in himself as a leader. In 1934, he abolished divorce, told women to stay home and have children, and introduced a special tax on bachelors.
Mussolini didn't so much rule Italy as edit it. He was an old-fashioned newspaper man, you know. It was a headline a day.
At the heart of his publicity was the Bonifica Integrale, the reclamation of the Pontini marshes, a project that Italy had been promising itself for many years and that annually made the Agro Pontino the scene of the most famous photo opportunity.
You've seen the pictures of Mussolini stripped to the waist, getting in the wheat, you know, Mussolini, the strong man, Mussolini with the father of the nation.
Two weeks after his return from Italy, Hitler had launched the purge of factional opponents known as the Night of the Long Knives.
The Night of the Long Knives is traditionally seen as the moment at which Hitler strikes out against his own people. The more radical Nazis think Hitler's takeover hasn't gone far enough.
The army leadership, the Reichswehr, was increasingly alarmed by the stormtroopers, the Sturmabteilung's, posture as an alternative army. The president was head of the armed forces, and when Hindenburg died, would the generals perhaps prefer a head of state less identified with and beholden to the SA than Adolf Hitler?
Deutschland, hurrah!
Of course, we shouldn't forget that Hitler himself, within his own party, was only one of several possible candidates. And it wasn't at all clear that Hitler himself wasn't going to be challenged by various groups.
The failing health of the president made resolution of the SA problem urgent. In June, the SA leadership, headed by Ernst Röhm, was purged.
Röhm was very useful as a bully boy, a tough guy on the street. But his belief was you wanted violent revolution. You seize power, you repeat the coup. And for Hitler, this was dated, this was out of fashion, it wouldn't work.
30th of June 1934, he moved against the SA and basically executed many of their leaders, or had Röhm murdered. So after that, the SA was totally tamed.
Das alles ist heim! Da möchte ich euch jetzt danken, dass ihr nicht Banken geworden seid, dass ihr mich in der Zeit nicht verlassen habt.
The Night of the Long Knives was presented as the overthrow of a threat to the state, that the stormtroopers had become too powerful, that they were plotting against Hitler. And it was actually irrelevant, it had nothing to do with that.
So there's a sort of typical Hitler sleight of hand going on here, that he seems to be striking towards the stormtroopers. But the more important target was the conservative resistance that was coming from within his regime.
I gave the order to shoot, Hitler boasted in a speech to the Reichstag on July 13th.
The patriot is dead at the hands of a murderer.
Less than 2 weeks later, Engelbert Dollfuss, the Austrian Chancellor was murdered by a couple of Nazis, aggravating Mussolini's fear of an Anschluss, an Austrian union with Germany. His response was to move 4 divisions up to Italy's frontier with Austria. In addition to Dollfuss, Mussolini was a patron of Gyula Gombusch's far-right regime in Hungary, and as we have noted, of the far-right in Spain. Towards the end of 1934, an Italian-trained Croatian fascist assassinated King Alexander of Yugoslavia.
Across Central and Eastern Europe, in Poland, in the Baltic states, in Hungary, in the Balkans, there has been a collapse of liberal democratic regimes from the mid-1920s onwards. Perhaps not a move towards fascism, but certainly towards right-wing authoritarianism.
On August 2nd, President Hindenburg died.
I think a major irony in the fact that in August 1934, Hindenburg goes to his grave, very happy about the fact that he thinks he has saved for all time his historical image, his aura of the kind of leadership he wanted to project. And of course, ironically, from our standpoint, nothing is so destructive of Hindenburg's image as the fact that he named Hitler as Chancellor.
A plebiscite would abolish the office of president and transfer its powers to the Führer. In September, to their unconditional acclaim, it was as absolute ruler that Hitler climbed onto the stage before the thousands gathered at the Nuremberg rally. The film of the rally, Triumph of the Will, is justly famous, though it was a box office failure, and the American columnist Walter Winchell declared that its director, Leni Riefenstahl, was as pretty as a swastika.
It's the moment that Hitler becomes a god. He is now no longer a mere mortal, and it's about the superheroism of Hitler.
Die Partei ist Hitler! Hitler aber ist Deutschland, wie Deutschland Hitler ist. Hitler! Sieg! Sieg!
In Paris, 15 people were killed and as many as 2,000 wounded in a long night of violence that would have repercussions.
The most spectacular moment of violence was on the 6th of February 1934, when a combination of right-wing organisations and veterans organisations tried to storm the Parliament building. And a few days later, on the 12th of February 1934, you have a huge rally of trade unionists and left-wing parties and movements in defence of the Republic.
Charles de Gaulle, who, at the time of the February events, wrote, "Today the ground under us is giving way. Where will it lead?" He ventured, in my humble opinion, to a reinforcing, or even better, restoration of order, but not without many more upheavals. Upheavals were also causing bloodshed on the streets of America. In January, the federal government was providing jobs for 4 million American workers. But having a job did not mean having a living wage. And there was widespread unrest. Labor unrest built through the year. The Toledo Auto Light strike in May was a foretaste of how things boiled over in the summer. The Minneapolis General Strike produced the tragedy of Bloody Friday, when police opened fire, leaving 2 dead and 67 injured. The West Coast longshore strike, earlier in the month, had also left 2 dead after Bloody Thursday. And the largest strike in American labor history, the textile strike, saw 10 killed in September. The New Deal had raised expectations, and Roosevelt had, between April and June, signed into law a Debt Default Act, Homeowners Loan Act, Securities Exchange Act, Trade Agreements Act, Farm Bankruptcy Act, and on and on. And yet, expectations were not being met. President Roosevelt needed to take action.
And so he begins to develop with his advisors a second New Deal. And this is the New Deal for which he is most remembered. This is the New Deal that is going to bring Social Security to the American people.
That reasonable profit can be earned, while at the same time protection can be assured.
Roosevelt will announce the framework for the second New Deal when he addresses Congress in January 1935. In India, what might have been a decisive step was taken in 1934.
The system sanctioned by the Government of India Act of 1934 allowed effectively almost 15% or so of Indians to exercise the vote. Now that was a big extension of political representation to India.
But one titan kept up his fierce opposition to Indian self-rule.
And Churchill spends a lot of time in the 1930s trying to get his anti-Indian self-rule voice heard over the BBC, and the BBC doesn't want to allow what they call his die-hard position on India to have a voice. And he is hopping mad about it.
This is no time to mince measures and fool around with weak government.
It was a battle that Churchill lost, but it taught him a useful lesson.
He wrote to his wife saying, I've just discovered that all this technique which I've been using for the last 35 years, it's not really necessary. What you need to do is stand up and make some remarks in a very sort of plain and conversational style.
In China, the politician, the titan, who had the upper hand was Chiang Kai-shek, whose nationalist forces had driven the Communist Party into a desperate retreat and who had shown himself to be a ruthless opponent.
Chiang Kai-shek has gone through a fairly volatile life, let us say, involved in Shanghai, very much in the revolutionary movements there after the fall of the Qing Empire in 1912. And these revolutionary movements were often a mixture of idealists trying to bring about a new China, linked with, it must be said, the underworld and some pretty nefarious practices.
The communist retreat to a remote stronghold is a foundation myth of the People's Republic, where it is celebrated as the Long March.
This was the defeat of the Communist Party. It gets re-narrated as the birth, the born-again moment.
It was, Mao said, our worst period, blocked in front and pursued from behind. But it was also the period in which Mao Zedong would rise to the position he would hold until his death.
Mao, because he's the one who leads them out of the jaws of defeat into this sort of new moment, gains in stature and becomes more or less the unquestioned leader of the communist movement in China.
The calendar flips. Adolf Hitler is Führer, Mussolini Il Duce, and Stalin is everywhere. By 1933, there were more than twice as many images of Stalin adorning Moscow as of Lenin. When Stalin made a rare public appearance at the 1935 Moscow Congress, the applause lasted for 15 minutes. Then a woman shouted, "Glory to Stalin!" and they all started clapping again. In September 1935, along with the Nuremberg laws restricting the rights of German Jews, an order was made installing the swastika as the official flag of the Reich, and on the 18th of October, Hitler told his officers, "Rearm and get ready. Europe is on the move again. If we are clever, we will be the winners." 13 days earlier, Italy had invaded Ethiopia.
When Mussolini came to power, their only colonies were Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. And Mussolini had longed to correct an injustice that had happened under the weak liberal government. In 1896, the Italians had tried to invade Ethiopia, and they'd been defeated.
So you get these squares and piazzas filled up with people, the triumphant leader announcing the war in Abyssinia.
The invasion of Ethiopia, then Abyssinia, began on October 3, 1935, when the first bombs fell on Adwa. Italy's opponent could boast 8 slow aircraft and 371 bombs.
People who were very prominent in the League of Nations and in anti-slavery societies in Britain and in France initially welcomed Mussolini's invasion because he says, well, I'm going in there to get rid of slavery. And they go, oh, that's marvelous, well done. And then, of course, the tanks roll in and they have to kind of say, oh no, this isn't quite what we had in mind.
In the wake of the brutal invasion of Abyssinia, the League of Nations imposed limited sanctions against Italy. Former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George described the League's sanctions as elaborate arrangements to deprive Italy of those things she could do without. Forbidden were donkeys and mules. Permitted were cars and trucks.
The Royal Navy dominated the Mediterranean and could have stopped without a thought this entire enterprise simply by denying him access to the Ethiopian coast, by blocking the Suez Canal. Such was the fear of creating another war. They thought, well, we mustn't precipitate this.
The military historian Basil Liddell Hart thought Britain's failure to stare down Mussolini in 1935 the most fateful turning point in the period between the wars. 2 days after the Italian invasion, Roosevelt proclaimed American neutrality and "to hell with Europe and the rest of those nations," exclaimed Minnesota Senator Thomas Shaw. As 1936 opened, Spanish Prime Minister Manuel Azaña wrote that the left feared a military coup, the right feared that the Soviet was on the horizon. "I've never," Azaña said, "seen such a stupid situation."
There's intense dialogue among the people who shared their own ideas. But there's no dialogue between people who have different ideas. And that's the problem. And eventually we'll have Spanish Civil War.
Elections for a new government held on February 16th were the last free elections held in Spain for 40 years. The result, announced on February 20th, gave the Popular Front a slender margin of less than 2%.
After the elections of the Popular Front in February 1936, it was decided that there were a whole series of generals who weren't to be trusted, so they were sent to different places to get them away from Madrid. While all the others were distributed all over the place, Franco was sent to be military commander of the Canary Islands.
The starter's gun, fired by General Mola, called on the Army of Africa to rise at 5 a.m. on July 18th, and the garrisons in mainland Spain to follow 24 hours later. Ibaruri, La Pasionaria, gave a radio speech on that day which went straight into legend. "The fascists shall not pass," she said. "No pasarán." In July and August, Hitler and Mussolini provided the first practical assistance, and it was decisive. They supplied the air transport that pitched Franco's crack Army of Africa into the battle.
Germany provided the airlift for the Army of Africa, without which the nationalist war effort would have been lost. Both boats, but also bombers that transported the troops across the Straits of Gibraltar.
The American ambassador in Madrid, Claude Boas, called the Spanish Civil War a foreign war of the fascist powers against the government of Spain. Churchill described non-intervention as an elaborate system of official humbug.
The democracies were feeble. There were, of course, strong voices agitating to stand up. But even Churchill was pretty feeble. He started by being pro-Franco.
On October 1st, Franco was invested with his new powers, head of the Spanish state, in the throne room of the Captain Generalcy in Burgos. But the war had many long and murderous months to run.
Franco was committed above all to what he saw as the eradication of Spain's internal enemies. And there's a long list of internal enemies for Franco.
On Saturday, March 7th, Hitler had addressed the Reichstag. The German government has from today restored the full and unrestricted sovereignty of the Reich in the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland, Hitler declared. And 600 deputies, in the words of American correspondent William Shirer, who was an eyewitness, leaped to their feet like automatons, their right arms upstretched in the Nazi salute, and screamed, "Heil!"
The Rhine and the territory alongside it is really key. And of course, it's also there as a border.
The Rhineland was a 50-kilometer wide strip of territory on the eastern bank of the River Rhine, which, kept demilitarized, constituted an important part of France's defendability.
The German military were terrified. They said that the French can just walk in and wipe us out. They hadn't got anything there, really, at all. And if the French had responded vigorously, I think Hitler might have been stopped in his tracks.
Of the remilitarization of the Rhineland, Lord Lothian comfortingly remarked that the Germans were only going into their own back garden.
The remilitarization of the Rhineland gives the National Socialist state and Hitler a set of resources that make them a much more formidable foe. And it's the only time Hitler says to his troops, if you meet opposition, come back. They never get that instruction again.
In explaining to the Parliament why Britain did nothing, Anthony Eden said, "It is the appeasement of Europe as a whole that we have constantly before us." And there he let loose a word that would be vilified for generations to come. Hitler had the Rhineland. He had the Berlin Olympics. he had increased the Wehrmacht's frontline divisions from 7 to 51 in just 3 years. And in Mussolini, he had an ally who was throwing his weight around.
Ethiopia was a great imperialist triumph. It was a correction of a historic injustice, and it was a way for Mussolini to shore up his popularity.
On November 1st, in a speech in Milan's Cathedral Square, Mussolini said that the Rome-Berlin Agreement was an axis around which all the European states who want peace can revolve. Marshal Badoglio had led his troops into Addis Ababa in May. There had been just over 1,000 Italian casualties. Assaulted by bombing, poison gas and massacre, Ethiopian casualties are uncounted.
Mussolini was the great prototype and also a working model of how a fascist society could actually work.
Between 1928 and 1936, as the 5-year plans rolled out, the Soviet Union explored how a communist society could actually work.
Stalin had in his hands the levers of great power in the Soviet Union, and he used them.
One of the things that lays behind the economic modernization of society is that the threat of an international conflict seems to be getting bigger and bigger through the 1930s.
In 1936, when the Third Reich had no modern tanks, the Soviet Union had 18,877. On June 27, 1936, President Roosevelt accepted the nomination of his party.
I accept the commission you have tendered me. I join with you. I am enlisted for the duration of the war.
To some generations, much is given, he said. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation of Americans, he said, has a rendezvous with destiny. His words carried a far greater truth than even he imagined. The 1936 election did more than return Roosevelt. As one of his aides remarked, it all but crowned him.
Roosevelt's own critics then accuse him of being the dictator. And then when he tries to get rid of some of the conservative Democrats from his own party, that's called a purge. So these notions that are out there in Europe that his own rivals are accusing Roosevelt of.
FDR's opponent carried only 2 states. In the 1934 midterms, similar support for the New Deal had sent 12 new Democratic senators to Washington, obliging many to find seats with the Republicans. The newcomers included Harry S. Truman from Missouri.
When Roosevelt wins his landslide re-election in 1936, which no one had necessarily foreseen, his first and real only major domestic measure of his second term is to try and reform the Supreme Court.
If we would make democracy succeed, I say we must act now.
Roosevelt was very frustrated and worried about the Supreme Court, and he put together this plan to add additional justices for every justice that would refuse to retire after the age of 70.
History would overwhelm Roosevelt's domestic concerns. In Japan, the tide was ebbing away from democracy. Anticipating all-out war following the Army's provocation of the Manchurian incident, the Army and Navy resisted towing the line drawn by party politicians. Amid the heightening discord, an unsuccessful but destabilizing coup attempt on February 26, 1936, destroyed any hope of a return to a normal course of constitutional government.
行動派というのは陸軍の中の一つのグループで、陸軍の言うことを聞いて陸軍に予算をたくさんくれる新しい政権の樹立です。
その周りの大臣や有力者たちを倒して天皇に直接自分たちの気持ちを説得すれば天皇は分かってくれると考えてクーデターを起こしたということです。
昭和天皇は非常に怒って行動派の青年将校たちを断固力でですね、鎮圧せよっていうふうに命令します。逆に陸軍の発言力は強まりました。その行動派と対立していた統制派と呼ばれる、これは東条英機たちですけれども、この人たちの力がですね非常に強くなるんですね。
Japanese expansion through Manchuria led some genuinely patriotic leaders in China to force a showdown, insisting that Chiang Kai-shek focus his strength not on eliminating the communists, but on the foreign invader. The affair is known as the Xi'an Incident.
Chiang was kidnapped by the former ruler of Manchuria, who'd been expelled by the Japanese takeover. I think Chiang realized after that he had to pull together with the communists in a united front.
It was the Xi'an incident that first revealed the skill and influence of Sung Mei-ling, Madame Chiang Kai-shek.
She came in and she acted as a broker. She smoothed things over between all of the key players. She persuaded the young general that he needed to release Chiang Kai-shek and that he would be protected.
In 1937, violence was rampaging through Spain. To the east, new records in terror were being set in the Soviet Union, and in China, an invader attacked. And the history books say that the war started in 1939.
World War II broke out on the 7th of July, 1937. This is not a date that European historians generally attribute to this event, but I think there is a very strong case that actually the Second World War began in Asia, and particularly with shooting between locally garrisoned Chinese and Japanese troops at a bridge called Lugotiao.
In 1937, the Japanese Ministry of Education issued a text titled Cardinal Principles of the National Polity. This was an official statement for use in schools. It defined the Japanese state as aggressively nationalist, imperialist, authoritarian, non-individualistic.
Then with the full-scale Japanese invasion in 1937, you have a real military power that's coming in and is sweeping through your land in a way that looks to be incredibly unstoppable.
From mid-July, Japanese troops were surging into China. By December, Chiang Kai-shek, already defeated in Beijing and Shanghai, had been forced to abandon Nanjing.
More actually from this point on until 1947, he was not actually affected much by the Japanese attack during those 12 years. So he started to build him as an ideologist, a military strategist, and also the unquestionable leader of the Chinese Communist Party.
Mussolini sent one of his most rabid supporters, Roberto Farinacci, to report on the war in Spain, in which he had invested heavily.
He sent a lot of technical experts, and he ended up sending many more troops than his generals wanted him to.
Viva Italia!
Farinacci reported that the war had become a contest between massacres, almost a sport. By February 1937, Italian air and land forces in Spain exceeded 50,000.
They suffer a severe military defeat in March 1937 at a place called Guadalajara. That further adds to the general sense in Europe, oh, Italians, typical, they can't fight. They couldn't even beat the Ethiopians in 1896, and now they're hopeless in Spain. And that further militarises the regime at home.
On April 26th, Germany's Air Force unit, the Condor Legion, arrived above Guernica, the holy city of the Basque. The raid killed 1 in 8 of the town's population. Of it, Hermann Goering said Germany could not do otherwise as we had nowhere else to try out our machines.
As far as Hitler was concerned, his participation in the Spanish Civil War had been immensely beneficial. They'd managed to trial a number of military tactics which would be used in the Blitzkrieg in Poland first and then in France. So for Hitler, the consequences were positive. For Mussolini, much less so.
Mussolini made his first official visit to Germany in September 1937. This time, Hitler was in uniform. It would be dangerous folly for the British people to underrate the amazing qualities of courage, comprehension, self-control, and perseverance which he exemplifies, Churchill wrote on October 10th. He was describing Mussolini. It was said that in the crowd welcoming Mussolini to Berlin were many who had been given cheering lessons in their workplaces. When Hitler made his return visit to Italy in May 1938, the cheering in Florence struck an even less sincere note. It was a recording played through loudspeakers. In May 1937, Neville Chamberlain entered Downing Street without an election. He was 68. Lord Halifax, who would become Foreign Minister in February 1938 and was the favourite of many, including the King, to succeed Chamberlain as Prime Minister in 1940, met Hitler on November 19, 1937, and wrote in his diary that he found him very sincere. Chamberlain described Halifax's visit to the Führer as a great success. In November, the British publisher, Victor Gollancz, chose Stalin as his Man of the Year because he was safely guiding Russia on the road to a society in which there will be no exploitation.
In 1937, the Soviet Union had a census, and the census brought quite surprising results. The number of people was far lower than expected, which led to the decision by Stalin to arrest those who had organized the census, execute a considerable number of them, and hide this census.
In April 1937, the Central Committee of the Communist Party officially launched the Great Terror, which would result in the judicial murder of 690,000 people. Molotov said of the terror, "We were driven in 1937 by the consideration that in time of war, we would not have a fifth column." To deal with the threat, they established 3-person commissions, troiki.
What happens in 1937 is extraordinary decision to re-establish troiki in all regions. It works on the basis that there's a great upsurge of criminal activity, which is largely attributed to former kulaks and to people who've returned from the camps.
These trials developed not from communism, not from socialism, but from Stalinism.
The notorious show trials and the work of the Troika were described by author, barrister and jurist Jeffrey Robertson as the public tip of Joseph Stalin's iceberg of terror.
It does strike me that Stalin wasn't alone with this. Maybe Khrushchev and the others were terrified in 52, 53, when Stalin really was going grumpy and off his rocker and saying things, but earlier on, they appear to have been equally involved.
The terror reached maximum pitch in July 1937. Perhaps the most extraordinary purge was of the leading ranks of the Red Army.
I think it's difficult to talk about the purge of the Red Army and say that there's some sort of golden mine. I think that the beginning of the purge is very much instigated by Stalin, and of course end up consuming tens of thousands of Soviet officers.
In Stalin's purges, 75 members of the 80-member Supreme Military Soviet were killed, while 13 out of 15 army commanders, 50 out of 57 corps commanders, 154 out of 186 divisional commanders, and 36,000 others were purged. In Chicago, on September 12th, the president delivered a speech calling on countries to quarantine the nations that were causing what FDR described as international anarchy and instability. The First Lady did not share his commitment to neutrality. Eleanor Roosevelt made speeches in support of the Spanish Republic and openly contributed to the Spanish Children's Fund and the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, one of the international brigades fighting on the Republican side. And she had a voice.
She had a syndicated column from about 1936 to the end of her life. And she wrote, for Look and Life and Time and Newsweek and Red Book and all the great magazines, and really had a very public life. She writes to a friend, "I have very good news. I have earned through my columns, through my newspaper and magazine articles, more than Franklin earned as president."
In India, the first elections under the new constitutional basis were held in 1937.
And it brought Congress governments into power in the majority of the provinces, because it also prepared the subsequent path of Indian nationalism towards a constitutional transfer of power, rather than a revolutionary overthrow of the empire.
This startled the All India Muslim League into action, and Jinnah returned from London to lead the league. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who deserves a place on the fringe of the Gallery of Titans.
Jinnah is really one of the great enigmas of 20th century India. Trained as a lawyer in London, a complete Anglophile, he was not a believer. He drank whiskey, he pork, ham sandwiches, etc. And yet he emerges as the leader of Indian Muslims. And this is the real paradox. Was it something that he willed? Was it purely his own personal ambition? Or was he fighting for a greater cause?
And for what did Eamon de Valera fight? He took his place on the fringe when he gained power in Ireland in 1932. What he fought for was defined in 1937.
One of Eamon de Valera's defining achievements was the 1937 Constitution. He worked closely with the Catholic hierarchy when he drafted it. The Constitution says a lot of things, but it states that women's place is in the home. It places the Irish language as the first official language, and perhaps most importantly, it lays claim to the 6 counties of Northern Ireland.
And Hitler will lay claim to the Sudetenland, and Japan will push further into China, And a man with an umbrella will take on the titans, but never become one. The world has changed. It is no longer after the First World War. It is now before the Second.